Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those joining us from different parts of the world. One last time, just for those that just joined, I'm going to give the instructions for turning on interpretation into Spanish, and then we'll get started. So this meeting is being live interpreted into Spanish, and if you're listening to me in English but you'd like to hear in Spanish, you can go to the meeting control settings, which may look like a globe on your computer or like 3 dots on your phone. And there you can select interpretation, and you can select English or Spanish. You can select mute original language to hear the interpretation language only and not the original language. If you have trouble doing this, just message us in the chat and a team member will message you personally to support you. Yo ahora voy a dar las instrucciones en español una última vez y empezamos. En esta reunión estamos utilizando interpretación en vivo entre inglés y español. Si le gustaría oír la reunión en español, haga clic en interpretación, que se puede ver como una imagen en un globo si está en su computador, o como 3 puntos en la parte inferior de la pantalla si está en su celular. Ahí debería poder ver el control de la reunión, donde se puede hacer clic en interpretación y escoger español o inglés. Si prefiere escuchar solo el idioma interpretado, puede hacer clic en silenciar audio original. Si tiene cualquier problema activando o manejando la interpretación simultánea, por favor diríjase a nosotros en la ventana del chat y le escribiremos directamente para ayudarle. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this roundtable on community policing. I am Sebastian Chasco, and I am the Director of the Peace and Recovery Program at Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA. IPA is a research and policy nonprofit that discovers and promotes effective solutions to global problems with a presence in 22 offices around the world. We are holding this event with Evidence in Governance and Politics, or EGAP. EGAP is a research evaluation and learning network that promotes rigorous knowledge accumulation, innovation, and evidence-based policy in various governance and accountability domains. IPA is a proud member of EGAP. Community policing, as we'll hear today, is a policing strategy used by police departments around the world. Yet, even though the impact of community policing has been evaluated in various contexts in the United States, so far, there has been limited research into the impact of community policing in other contexts, particularly in middle and low-income countries. It is for this reason that it is particularly exciting to be here today to discuss the findings of impact evaluations on community policing that were carried out in a coordinated way across 6 countries. We have a great lineup today. Graham Blair, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the lead investigator of this research project, will present the findings on this multi-country study on community policing. We are also honored to be joined by Natalie Alvarado, Head of Security and Justice at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Zulfikar Hamid, Additional Inspector General of Police Operations in Punjab, Pakistan, who will reflect on what this research means for practitioners and policy makers. As you've noticed, we did not set up today's convening as a webinar, but rather as a roundtable meeting. As a result, you are able to turn on your microphone and your camera. Feel free to keep your camera on during the event, but we ask that you mute your microphone while you are not speaking. If you have questions or comments, you can type into the text box, or you can raise your virtual hand or your real hand, and I will call on you so you can turn on your microphone. You can also text me in Zoom. In order to avoid disturbances during the presentations, we have a technology team that will mute microphones that are turned off if they're turned on out of turn. After Graham's presentation, I will take 1 or 2 questions from participants before moving on to Natalie and Zulfikar's responses. I want to mention that we are recording this session and may make it publicly available on our websites. As we are using simultaneous interpretation today, our interpreters have asked us to speak a bit slower than usual to allow them to interpret fluently. With that, I'll hand it over to Graham.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to share the results from our work on community policing with you that's based on a collaboration of 20 social scientists and 6 police agencies around the world. And thanks especially to Natalie and Zulfikar for discussing. It's a particular pleasure to have Zulfikar with us, who was our partner in developing the project that I'll describe in Punjab province in Pakistan today. And thanks to Sebastian and the team at IPA for organizing what I expect will be a really interesting discussion. Apologies. So as Sebastian said, this project is organized by EGAP, which is a group of social scientists and practitioners who develop randomized trials and other high quality research evidence to address pressing public policy concerns, typically in partnership, as this research was, with governments and civil society organizations. And our project is part of EGAP's Metaketa initiative. One of the concerns about how evidence from randomized trials accumulates to inform policy decisions is that experiments are conducted in one place and one time. And it can be hard to know whether these results really travel to other contexts where policymakers currently face a decision. And so the Metaketa initiative represents a new approach to addressing this problem, which is running multiple experiments in multiple contexts to not only learn what works, but where. EGAP's run 4 other Metaketa projects in addition to this one on information and accountability in elections, on taxation, on stewardship of natural resources, and a new one is ongoing on women's empowerment. Today, I'm going to talk with you about the problem of crime and insecurity in the global South. The past half century have seen really big improvements in violence around the world. Deaths from war have declined really substantially. But hidden in that trend is that organized crime and homicide has, in many regions of the world, actually been on the rise. And today, 1 in 4 people, or about 1.5 billion people, are living in contexts of violence and insecurity. As a result, reducing crime and insecurity now stands at the top of the global policy agenda. UN Sustainable Development Goals, adopted in 2015, commit countries to achieve just, peaceful, and inclusive societies with a focus on insecurity due to crime and violence. And at the same time, with widespread Black Lives Matter protests against police abuse in the United States and around the world, the issue of how to address inequalities in the criminal justice system and rein in police abuse has never been more salient. The most prevalent policy solutions to reducing crime and building secure communities often start with the police. Since the origins of modern policing in the early 1800s, societies around the world have relied on a professional, uniformed, and regulated authority to prevent crime and maintain order. But the creation of modern policing generated a set of problems of its own. Politicians and governments have interfered with the police for political gain. The police themselves have misused their coercive capabilities, which is the driving concern behind the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. And the police have faced the challenge of maintaining the respect and trust of citizens, which is the problem that I'll focus on primarily today. Why is trust important? A starting point is the need for legitimacy of the state's law enforcement agency in a democracy. But we also care about trust instrumentally because of its links with police effectiveness. Effective policing requires the cooperation of citizens who provide tips about future crimes and evidence about past offenses. And when citizens don't trust the police, often they don't cooperate with law enforcement efforts. Trust in the police, though, varies quite considerably around the world. In Latin America, where we conduct 2 of our experiments, less than half of citizens trust the police. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 60%, and in South Asia, 74%. But in the US and Western Europe, it's considerably higher. And in fact, in many Western European countries, people seem to trust the police more than they trust their neighbors. Of course, we shouldn't be confused. In these places even, there's a large minority-majority trust gap, with Black and Latino Americans holding much lower trust in the police than do white Americans, for example. And this gap can be found in most countries around the world between minority and majority groups. So one of the central problems that societies face then in reducing crime is that many policies that were designed to reduce crime have the side effect of reducing community trust in the police. And we can really find examples in every country and in every time period. We can think of stop and frisk policies in New York City, pacification campaigns in Rio in Brazil, and the many broken windows policing efforts around the world, all of which aimed to reduce crime, but ended up undermining citizen trust and with it cooperation with the police. As a result, we ask in this research whether it's possible to reduce crime while building positive community police relations, and we do so by focusing on the idea of community policing, which is one of the most celebrated police reforms in recent decades. Community policing at its core is a strategy for encouraging the public to act as partners with the police in preventing crime and promoting security based on the needs of each individual community. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to convince you that what we did was to implement what a practitioner or scholar of community policing would agree was a substantial increase in the intensity of community policing as it's implemented in practice. As I'll show you in a minute, community policing is an extremely wide adoption. There are few places that have not adopted any of the components of community policing. And as a result, when we're introducing community policing is introducing community policing is proposed to reduce crime and rebuild citizen trust, what that typically means is an increase in its strength, given the details of the setting. And that's exactly what we did here in this set of 6 experiments. I'll show you that what we find in general is that it doesn't live up to its promise. We find limited evidence in 3 cases of effects on citizen attitudes towards the police, but no effects in the other settings. And what I'll argue is that a series of structural constraints seem to have held back the effectiveness of community policing in these 6 settings. Community policing in its implementation varies across the world, but there are often 4 core components to it. The first is frequent local beat patrols, where individual officers are assigned to a particular area to patrol, get to know citizens and local business owners. The second is decentralized decision-making, decentralizing some of the decisions about how to allocate police effort down to the patrol officers and their supervisors. The third is community engagement, just a set of tools including town hall meetings that aim to bring citizens and the police into more frequent communication and to identify problems in the community. And the fourth is problem-oriented policing, which is a set of strategies for addressing the problems that are raised by citizens and identified by the police through beat patrols and community engagement. So in thinking about how community policing might work, we can think of a theory of change here where we start with local beat patrols and town hall meetings, which are meant to identify information about potential crimes, potential crime prevention tips from citizens. This then leads to a set of responses by the police, either through problem-oriented policing strategies or through their allocation of police effort from decentralized decision-making that comes with it. And this is meant to lower crime and decrease perceptions of insecurity. I want to highlight the core role that citizen trust plays in this picture, which is that these local beat patrols and town hall meetings are also meant to increase citizen trust, which plays a key role in citizens' choice about whether to provide crime prevention tips and evidence about past crimes. Police responses also are likely to affect levels of citizen trust. And so it's the creation of a positive cycle between trust and crime. Community policing is in wide use across the world. Police agencies on every continent have adopted community policing in some form. In the US, where we have very good data, about 30% of US police agencies have implemented community policing, and 90% of the largest agencies have. A key advocacy organization, the International Council of Chiefs of Police, advocates for it as a key operational philosophy for all police agencies. In Iraq and Afghanistan, where coalition forces constructed new police forces, this was a core part of their training. And similarly, UN peacekeeping training for police forces around the world includes community policing as an essential part. And in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests in the US and in other countries and in Nigeria over the last couple of days, community policing is one of the key policy responses that is often suggested for rebuilding trust between citizens and the police. There is a set of existing research on community policing. As Sebastian mentioned, it's primarily from the US and also from the UK and Australia. This research finds that increased community presence of the police in the form of police patrols on foot and on vehicles, as well as problem-oriented policing strategies, seem to reduce crime. But there is mixed and kind of limited evidence on the effects of these interventions on citizen trust. And so we don't know how these interventions affect both crime and trust at the same time. There's almost no evidence from the global south. This is changing quickly. There's an increasing number of researchers that are partnering with police agencies and governments to learn about police reforms, but currently there's still a relative lack of evidence on whether this works in low and middle income countries. And few of these studies examine the multiple components of community policing together as they're implemented as a policy strategy in police agencies. So we implemented this Metaketa study of community policing to try to address some of these areas. So what we did was, in 6 contexts in the global south, we implemented randomized trials. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. And then we implemented community policing in a set of police beats and neighborhoods and villages in some places and not others. And then we ran standardized surveys across all of those places in order to measure the effects of these changes to community policing practices, both in areas where we implemented them and then in others where we made no changes to existing police practices. So our goal here is to compare outcomes in places with community policing practices increased to those without. But the problem is that police agencies with poor community relations may choose to adopt or be forced to adopt community policing practices as a way to rebuild trust in their community. And so when we're comparing places that have and haven't adopted it in the world, we're often going to be picking up these underlying differences in community relations rather than the impacts of community policing changes. So the solution of the randomized trial design is instead to use a lottery to pick which areas adopt community policing and which don't. And then what we're going to do is compare otherwise similar places that did or did not adopt community policing. We worked with 6 teams and 20 researchers who developed these projects in 6 contexts. They had developed a partnership with a relevant police agency who really wanted to learn more about community policing and whether and how this was a tool that could improve community relations and reduce crime. These 6 teams then worked with a steering committee who helped harmonize interventions so we could test a common model of community policing and then a common set of measures so that we could be learning about the effects of this intervention across these 6 contexts in a comparable way. In each site, we conducted an ethics review and introduced safeguards to try to identify when problems emerged as a result of the intervention and to consider shutting down the interventions. None of those happened, and I'm happy to talk more about some of those procedures. So as I mentioned, we worked in 6 countries. We worked in Brazil, Colombia, Liberia, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Uganda. And I'll briefly describe each of those contexts that we worked in now. So the first was in Santa Catarina state in Brazil. This is a state with relatively low crime relative to other places in Brazil, but high in absolute terms across the world. It's a context that has organized crime present. And we worked with the Santa Catarina military police to expand out an existing community policing program called Rede de Vizinhos. And we ran an experiment in 196 urban neighborhoods across the state over the course of 7 months to learn about the effects of increasing community policing practices. Second, we worked in the city of Medellin in Colombia. In the 80s, this was known as the most violent city in the world, the home of Pablo Escobar's gang. And since then, there's been a really marked improvement in crime, but trust in the police has not increased in parallel. People still think of this when asked in surveys as a more violent place than it is. And so we worked with the Medellin Metropolitan Police to try to expand the use of community policing in the city. Aspects of community policing have been implemented in the past, but not regular community meetings between citizens and the police. And so that's what we implemented across 347 police beats across the city over the course of 12 months. The third context that we worked in was the capital city of Liberia, Monrovia. We worked with the Liberian National Police, which is a new police force constituted since the end of the Civil War in 2003. This is a context that remains very violent and has a high degree of vigilantism. About 25% of communities report having an active local security group. And we worked with the Liberian National Police to introduce community policing systematically in Monrovia for the first time. Liberia, I should mention, is the site of a ton of great recent policing research, including on confidence patrols in rural parts of Liberia and other police reforms. In our experiment, we increased community policing practices across 100 neighborhoods in Monrovia over the course of 11 months, many selected by the Liberian National Police as places that they thought would be especially suitable for community policing in high crime areas. The first place that we worked with Zulfikar Hamid was in Sheikhupura region in Pakistan. It's outside of Lahore. This is an area and a context with much lower crime rates than our other 5 sites, but police are among the least trusted institutions in Pakistan when asked in surveys. There are a number of reasons for this. Police are constrained in investigating major crimes and are restricted to investigating relatively smaller crimes without the authority of a magistrate judge. And people perceive that political connections are needed for the police to be responsive. We partnered with the Punjab Police Agency and ran an experiment in 108 police beats over the course of 6 months. Next, we worked in the Philippines in Sorsogon province. We worked with the Philippines National Police, which citizens associate with President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war, which is taking place in other parts of the country. The police are not part of that campaign of extrajudicial killings in Sorsogon province, but nevertheless, citizens associate with them, and so that's really undermined citizen trust in the police. This is also a context with a low-level insurgency that's taking place in other parts of Sorsogon province. We only worked in areas without regular insurgent activity. And so we partnered with the police across 298 barangays, which in urban areas are like neighborhoods and in rural areas are villages, over the course of 17 months to implement a set of changes to community police practices. Finally, we partnered with the Ugandan police force to implement community policing in rural areas across Uganda. Community policing was tried in one urban community near Kampala a number of years ago, and it was determined to be a failure. This project was started from the premise that the model might be effective in rural areas of the country. In Uganda, the police serve a dual role. They work to prevent crime, but they also are a tool of the ruling party, Museveni's party. And so citizens demand increased police presence to reduce crime, but are also, the police suffer from a lack of trust because of this collaboration with the ruling party. We partnered with the Ugandan police force to roll out this set of community policing practices in 72 police stations over the course of 13 months. So I want to emphasize the diversity of these 6 contexts. Half were democracies, half were autocracies. There's wide variation in how corrupt they are, from a high in Uganda to a low in Brazil. And they range from some of the poorest countries in the world in Liberia to the upper middle income range in Colombia and Brazil. So if these increases in community policing practices work or don't, this is going to be instructive about whether this will work in other parts of the global south. So the intervention that we implemented in all 6 places was a set of locally appropriate increases in community policing practices developed in partnership with the police themselves. And this took the form of four components. The first was town hall meetings between citizens and local police commanders. In these meetings, citizens shared concerns and highlighted community problems that lead to crime, and local police commanders attended and provided information about criminal justice procedures, including how to report crimes, and tried to develop potential solutions to these issues. The second was an increase in the frequency of foot patrols. In 3 of our settings, we increased the frequency. These are patrols in which police get to know citizens and local business owners. Third, we introduced or widely marketed citizen feedback hotlines. These are anonymous ways for citizens to report on crime and police abuse. And finally, we introduced community watch forums in which community watch groups or neighborhood watch groups, which are informal groups organized locally that aim to complement efforts by formal security services. And in these watch forums, the police aimed to formalize these groups and engage with them to cooperate with the police rather than to kind of act independently. In all cases, some form of town hall citizen police meetings were held. In about half, foot patrol frequency was increased. In half, citizen feedback mechanisms were introduced or promoted, and in half, forums are created to formalize citizen community watch groups. In addition, in most of these contexts, some form of training was provided for police. This training took different forms. In Pakistan, it was quite an intensive multi-day training on problem-oriented policing strategies and on the effective ways to hold town halls and engage with citizens in community watches. And in others was a lighter touch training. The community policing programs lasted between 6 and 17 months in these settings. After we implemented community policing, we measured 4 sets of outcomes to try to understand how these changes to community policing practices affected these kind of core outcomes that we care about. The first was security. So we conducted a gold standard victimization survey of citizens and also measured perceived insecurity. The second, we measured citizen perceptions of the police through a survey, both of police capacity, responsiveness, and police intentions towards citizens. We then also interviewed officers to understand their perceptions of citizens and their norms of police behaviors. And we measured citizens' cooperation in terms of tips provided to the police about future crimes and reports of police abuse. All in all, we conducted 17,000 interviews of citizens, 650 interviews of officers, and we collected crime data with the police on 600 neighborhoods, villages. As I previewed, the overall findings are that there was no impact overall on security, trust, or cooperation from these increases in community policing practices. We see limited positive results that I'll describe on some citizen attitudes, but only in some contexts. And so I'll present these results and then try to unpack why we might have seen this lack of changes. So I'm going to present these graphically. So to orient you to this image, on the x-axis here on the bottom, we have the impact of increasing the strength of community policing practices from negative change to a large positive change. And so first, I'm showing you the effects on crime victimization. So we see the dot here represents the estimated effect of community policing on crime victimization. So we should expect a negative effect, and that these confidence intervals should exclude 0. What we in fact see is a really small negative effect, but our confidence intervals include the possibility that there were both negative effects and increases or backlashes on crime victimization. So this is not an effect, not the expected reduction in crime that we expected to see. Next, I'm going to show you the effects on our core measurement of trust, which is overall perceptions of the police. Here, we should see trust going up if community policing is working. Again, that's not what we see, although we see a small positive effect. We can't distinguish that from no effect at all. It's possible that there was even a very small backlash there. And when we look across all of these effects on crime victimization, on perceived future insecurity, on the police perceptions of citizens, on police abuse, citizen cooperation, and reporting of police abuse, we see that there are no significant changes in these kind of top-level outcomes of community policing. So overall, across our 6 contexts, community policing does not seem to lead to the changes that are expected by its proponents. We do find some mixed evidence on citizen attitudes, on how community policing practices change citizen perceptions of the police. As I mentioned, we saw no change in our core trust outcome in any context or overall, but we do see an improvement in perceived police intentions in Liberia and Pakistan, and a small improvement in perceived police capacity in Colombia. So what I want to do now, those are our core results from our experiment. What I want to do now is share some of our, what I think are informed speculations about why community policing might have fallen short of our expectations for it. We identified 3 structural constraints that may have interrupted its effectiveness, which are a lack of prioritization by station leaders and in some cases by central police leadership, a rapid rotation of line officers and leadership in a couple of contexts, and in many of the contexts, a limited capacity of the police to address community concerns that were raised through town hall meetings and foot patrols. So in terms of the rapid officer rotation, in many sites, officers are regularly rotated between stations as policy. And so in the areas that we're able to measure in Pakistan and the Philippines, police are rotated on at sometimes on the order between 1 and 3 months, which may undermine the ability of the police to get to these beat officers to get to know people in the community, to build relationships, and to obtain information about potential problems. Second, in terms of the capacity and resource constraints of the police, which may undermine their ability to respond to concerns that are raised by the community, some of our contexts are serving huge populations with few officers and few resources. So for example, in Liberia, there's a $3,000 per officer budget, which is 5% of the budget available in Brazil, and serving a population of about 1,000 people compared to about 300 in Colombia. So in terms of the implications of this research for policy, we think that structural reforms, larger structural reforms may be needed for incremental changes to police practices, such as these community policing interventions, to yield changes to these core outcomes that we care about in security and citizen trust. These might involve changing the incentives of officers and police leadership to tie them to building citizen trust and reducing crime, and the creation of mechanisms for citizens to not just share their concerns, but to hold the police to account for failures to deliver on them. Second, efforts to improve citizen-police relations that have been shown in past evidence to be effective in global north contexts in the US, the UK, and Australia may fall short in police agencies that don't have the resources to respond to community concerns, and may create false expectations of citizens who have shared issues that they think would reduce crime, and then the police have been unable to follow up. Finally, the rapid rotation of line officers and station leadership may interrupt any police reforms because community policing and other kinds of citizen police reforms rely on citizens getting to know the police and vice versa. And so with this rapid rotation on the order of a month or 3 months, that local knowledge and those relationships can't be built. So where do we go next? We think that a set of new research is needed to understand the circumstances under which community policing might be effective, or the additional interventions that might need to be added to this to make it effective. And so might need to change the incentives of station leaders and higher level police leadership to compel the changes in beat officer behavior. Second, we need to embed officers for longer periods in the community in order to see gains in citizen trust and this virtuous cycle between citizen cooperation and reduction in crime. And we may want to explore pairing community engagement tools like community policing with citizen accountability tools that might change incentives as well. So that's what we have. This research is the product of the work of many people across each of these contexts. These are the research teams, and all of them are happy for you to reach out to them to ask particular questions about their context and the learning from each of those experiments that we conducted. And I'm also happy to answer your questions by email or follow-up call. And we're happy to share the scientific working paper that we've prepared on these results across the 6 contexts. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Graham, for that fascinating and very clear presentation. I can only imagine it's challenging to present on 6 countries in half an hour. Well, thank you so much. Before we jump into Natalie's and Zulfikar's reflections on the research, I wanted to open up the opportunity for any pressing questions. If anyone has a question, please go ahead and raise your virtual hand or your physical hand. or mention in the chat that you'd like to speak, and I'll call on you. I would just ask that you please keep your question or comment to a maximum of a minute, and that you please introduce yourselves before you speak. And I see that Santiago Tobon has raised his hand. Santiago, go ahead.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, I raised my real hand because I couldn't find the virtual hand. Graham, thank you for this great presentation. I actually collaborated a bit at the beginning with Eric and Dorothy on the experiment in Medellin, so I'm very familiar with it. I think this is a major contribution to policy and to our understanding of how criminal markets work, how police departments work, and what can we do to actually like improve them. So I have like one general question on your take up in the end on the mechanisms and the explanations for these results. So one thing is, I believe you're like focused on like explaining the results through like the supply channel, which are the challenges that the police itself faces, right? And I think that there can be two other kind of explanations. One is who else supplies these kinds of services in certain like places, like for instance, in the context of Medellin specifically, we've been studying like in parallel with Eric and Dorothy and the team, and another research agenda with Chris Bladman and others, where we actually are documenting how like local gangs actually provide some of these services, provide security, dispute resolution, and others, and also like what people actually demand. And people sometimes is expecting the police to solve some problems, but sometimes the police doesn't have the comparative advantage to solve some problems. So even if they actually try to do it, people might just rely on the gang leader to try to just resolve the dispute with the neighbor because they actually do it faster. So I just wanted to bring these things to see whether you consider these, because I think these are these like more structural situations about gangs and gang governance and other kind of situations happen mostly in the global south rather than the US or the UK. They happened in the US and the UK perhaps like a century ago, but then I believe this can be like another possible explanation for the findings that you're actually looking at.
Thanks. I think it's a great point, and I basically agree with you. Our study in Medellin was not set up to measure substitution between these informal security providers and the formal security providers of the police, but our study in Liberia was. We went in with the expectation that this intervention might really change how people thought about the choice between seeking security from local vigilante groups in that context. And in the paper that comes out of that, we do find that people move away from demand for these vigilante groups to provide safety and security, and move toward the neighborhood watch groups that are promoted in the community policing intervention. So it'd be really interesting to talk more about how we can make sure that our two experiments going on at the same time in Medellin can speak to each other. Thanks.
Thanks.
Great, thanks, Santiago. And I see one more hand was raised, Alberto Nieto. Please go ahead and please introduce yourselves before you speak.
Hello, Graham, and thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. I have one question, probably. Do you think that results of this experiment could have a different outcome if the interventions were not so broad in terms of packing into a very broad concept of the intervention of police-oriented or POP? Like, because I have in mind the other interventions such as hotspot policing or focus deterrence. So do you think it will be different outcome? Because probably what we're seeing here is that community policing is only just a bit of the more complex equation that police have or alternatives, sorry, for reducing crime.
Thanks. I think that's an important question. Like, how does community-oriented policing fit into the other set of strategies that police have? And I think you're right that hotspot policing and increasing community presence is one of the other major tools. And there's some great evidence coming out of Colombia about its effectiveness. I think that we went into this with the expectation that in some places, community-oriented policing, which is a strategy that where there's a lot of policy demand for this alternative of not just reducing crime, but directly targeting citizen trust in the police, would have effects at least on those citizen trust outcomes. And so I think I see this fitting into a broader set of research about other police strategies, and this is one of those that is widely adopted. And so it's important to understand that. And even if it's the case that in many kinds of contexts, community policing is not a strategy that is effective, that's important to know because it is being adopted in many of those places right now.
Great, thanks, Graham and Alberto. I see 2 more hands have been raised, so my suggestion is we take those 2 questions, and then we move on to Natalie. So the next hand that I saw raised is Morgan Wack. Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Graham, appreciate the talk. It was great, very insightful. I just had a quick programmatic question. I'm wondering, you talked about the response, the community reporting mechanisms that you had through WhatsApp and some of these other channels. And I'm wondering if, consistent with your hypothesis on a lack of response, did you see a decrease in reporting as these trials continued? Or if people were unable to respond in time, or there was a lack of success on behalf of police, did you see a tail off in the number of crimes reported or anything like that that would be consistent? Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's a great question, one we haven't explored yet, and I think we'll do that analysis. And I think it's a reasonable expectation here that community policing, by rolling out this intervention that promises to increase police responsiveness in the community and to address these problems, that people might begin to engage and then see that there isn't a follow-up, and then kind of tail off their excitement about it. We don't see a tail off in attendance in community meetings over time, which is one thing that we've looked at. But I think that's a great suggestion that we'll look into.
Great, thank you.
Great, and one more question from Elena Tetrol-Rooney. If you could go ahead.
Hi, Graham. Thanks for the presentation. I think that it's a fascinating research project and just really excellent to take this Metaketa approach. One question that I had, and sorry, I'm from USAID Senior Violence Prevention Advisor in the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention. So one question that I had that I think builds on Santiago's question earlier is whether or not there was any comparison done on the degree to which crimes actually reached resolution. So kind of tying the police to the justice sector, because I think similar to whether or not they're looking to other groups to provide that justice response, the effectiveness of the justice system writ large is very closely tied to how people perceive the effectiveness of policing. So I'm curious, one, if that was taken into account in doing the analysis, or if there were any simultaneous interventions done with the justice system at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is one example of an intervention that we should be testing alongside community policing. The answer to both of your questions is basically no. There weren't other components of the intervention that focused on the broader justice sector, except that during town hall meetings, information was provided about the criminal justice procedures. And so I think one of the components of many community policing trainings is educating people about how to report crimes and police abuse, and kind of what happens in the process from when you report that crime through its life cycle through the criminal justice system. And there was, I guess I would say, a limited amount of information provided about that broader life cycle to citizens during town halls. But I think that it is certainly a reasonable hypothesis that if we had changed attitudes towards the police, but not about what happens after the police, that citizens might not have continued to cooperate because of their expectations about a lack of responsiveness further down the chain.
Great. Well, thanks for all of those questions. I mean, it's great to see so much interest and participation. Now let's move on to Natalie, and after Natalie speaks, I'll open up again to see if anyone else has any questions or comments before we move on to Zulfikar. So Natalie, please go ahead. The floor is yours. We look forward to your reflections.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers of the event and the authors of this incredible study. Graham, great presentation. Thank you. Very, very, very clear. As you mentioned, insecurity is a really great challenge in all countries, and particularly in Latin America, which is the most violent region in the world. Crime significantly hinders social and economic development, and that for two reasons. They mainly affects most vulnerable populations, and for example, in Latin America, the homicides is the leading cause of death for individuals aged 18 to 25. But they also impose a significant cost on economies. In our latest study of 22 countries, we found that crime and violence cost the region about 3.5% of its GDP. To give you an idea, this cost is almost double the region's total yearly spending on infrastructure. And this is why for the IDB, crime and violence are not just security problems, they are foremost development challenges. For over 20 years, the IDB citizen security and justice sector has supported police agency in a range of capacity building, institutional strengthening initiatives. We have supported police agencies in everything from deep reform that are focused on human capital development in Honduras, to development of crime analysis units or adoption of new information system for targeting patrols, for example, in Uruguay, and the combination of sometimes of those approaches in countries like Ecuador. An important step in knowing how to better support police forces is to understand how agencies are adapting and responding to the modern challenges they face. Two critical questions we are always asking is, what works and what is the evidence? Unfortunately, most of the evidence, as Graham mentioned, of what works on policing comes from developed countries. As the study points out, institutions in these countries, especially the police, are vastly different and operate in a different context from what we see, for example, in Latin America. So there is always the question, how much of the evidence from US, UK, and Australia is really relevant and applicable to the Latin American context? In Latin America, there is a lack of rigorous studies compared to this one, unfortunately. However, several studies have been developed in recent years, in many cases supported by the IDB. Therefore, the production of this study, specifically with such as geographical diversity, is extremely timely and relevant. As the study indicated, there has been great interest internationally around community policing. This is also true in Latin America, where police reform projects has adopted community policing as the international best practice. In our region, challenges for the police are particularly significant for multiple reasons. First, the level of violent crime are the highest in the world. Second, there is a high perception of insecurity. Third, corruption and organized crime are major concerns. Fourth, some police agencies in the region had the history of being associated with authoritarian regimes. Fifth, there is a lack of institutional capacity in some countries. And all these aspects have resulted in low levels of trust in institutions in general and the police in particular. In this context, community policing has been put forward as one of the solutions. It's a way of democratizing the police and increasing public trust. As in the United States or UK, in the region, we have seen a widespread increase of programs labeled as community policing. But as you also mentioned in the study, defining community policing is particularly challenging. We believe that this is, in fact, one of the reasons for its broad appeal to so many stakeholders, and is generally accepted by police forces, by policymakers, and also the community, because community policing is in many different things to different people. Therefore, it is very difficult to identify specific community policing interventions and their outcomes, evaluate their effectiveness, or to consider replication in different settings. One of the positive aspects of the study that you presented today, it is that harmonizes 2 elements and 4 outcomes across the 6 locations studied, which are common to many programs recognized by experts as promising, although there is still significant difference between the settings. What we often observe in Latin America is that those who has been implementing community policing emphasize that it should be considered an organizational strategy or philosophy. However, in practice, it is very often implemented as a side program separated from other public functions. The result is this allows police to maintain the traditional order and a way of doing things. In summary, community policing is often seen as one and only one of many programs, rather than a structural change or through democratization of the decision process in the police. It has been also our experience, while it is possible for some police departments to actually create new structures and processes to truly engage the community and to give a role in setting priorities, this is the exception and really is not the rule. More commonly, community policing is implemented as a standalone program in a superficial way, which is more like a repackaging of the old ways of doing things. Therefore, for those of us working with the police in Latin America, the findings of this study were not surprising. We have long understood that incremental changes, one-off initiative, or adding isolated programs to police agencies are unlikely to lead to really significant long-term changes, neither in crime reduction nor in public perception. Whether it be community policing or hotspot policing, these initiatives alone, separated from a broader institutional changes, are really insufficient. Larger and more complete organizational reforms of police forces is what we think is needed. Given the tremendous challenges in Latin American countries, including, as I mentioned, low levels of confidence in police, high levels of violence and organized crime, and the very weak nature of criminal justice institutions in general, we would not expect a set of standalone community policing activities to reduce the deep mistrust and high levels of crime. To address this, we're working to support governments in Latin America and their police agencies, with the support also with the research community, to analyze more questions about police as an institution. How the police should be recruited, trained, paid. How can police agencies be held accountable? What practices, incentive, training are more effective to improve relations with the community or reduce crime? Which organizational structures are more effective? And which are the best mechanisms for motivating officers to be proactive and to engage with the community? Although we don't have all the answers for these questions, the IDB is working in initial contribution in this regard. Given the very close and independent nature of the police institution, as you know very well, in Latin America, there is little public information available about those organizations. That is why the IDB has been working in a flagship study, mapping out the organizational structures and processes of police agencies in the region. We have been collecting data in a standardized format on management practice, selection, training, motivation of officers, deployment strategies, and performance criteria, among others. We're also looking at the accountability mechanisms and transparency, as well as the decision-making and priority settings. We now have data from 20 police agencies in the regions. We will present in our upcoming studies on who our police forces are, how they are operating, and how this compares to the evidence and best practices that currently exist. Concluding, as we all know, crime is very complex, and many governments are willing to improve the effectiveness of their citizen security policies. For this, the role of research in citizen security is essential. As you know, unlike other development disciplines like education, health, in which there is already more advanced consensus of what works, crime still is a very understudied area in Latin America. The challenge for the knowledge agenda are large, and in fact, conducting rigorous research in this sector, as you know, as a researcher, is very difficult. I can think of 4 main obstacles to generate evidence-based policies. The first is the lack of technical capacity in some countries in Latin America to collect, analyze quality data, and to undertake rigorous evaluations. Second, a preference to protect and not to share criminal information due to political sensitivities. Third, frequent changes, as was mentioned by Graham, in leadership that generate changes in police priorities. And fourth, governments need quick results, and evaluations take time. There is one last message that I would like to leave with you today, that it's important that we make sure that every knowledge that we generate goes beyond academic papers and reaches practitioners and policymakers to inform public policy. And I believe that events like this one adds a lot of value in facilitating and promoting the exchange of knowledge and elevating the issue among governance officials, academic institutions, and organizations. Therefore, we should continue to work on building these bridges together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Natalie, for sharing your reflections and the work that the IDB is doing. And I agree with you, we should do more of this. And I'm glad that now with all of our adoption of Zoom, it's become easier to share these results with practitioners and policymakers around the world. So again, before moving to Zulfikar, I'd like to open up the opportunity to open up the floor for 1 or 2 questions. And I already saw one hand go up. Ronald Ruyombia, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself, and please make sure to keep your question or comments to a maximum of a minute. Please go ahead.
I have one, and I appreciate Natalie. Thank you very much for the submission. I agree with Natalie. I think we need to start from the definition of community policing. Whereas the definition itself looks really good, but the practices are different. We are still practicing the reactive way of doing things. I think as we talk about the role of police, mostly on the item of partnerships, we need to talk about the role of police, not only at enforcement and ETC, but also who are other stakeholders in the policy formulation. Because the most conflicts you see and the lack of trust in the police is because they put a lot of energy and they are front line of the implementation of these policies which are created. But how are they created? Are they pro-people? That's the starting point. So if we could broaden the partnerships beyond police and people, but also look at other ministries. For example, in the case of Uganda and the case of town hall meetings, is that if you call a town hall meeting to resolve a certain issue with the public, then do you mind having someone from the Ministry of Agriculture available if that concern is in the ministry? So it comes back to such. And without wasting much time, I think I agree with Natalie's submission, and thanks very much. And so we need to look at all those ways.
Great, thank you so much, Ronald, for your comment. So I saw one hand go up and then go back down. Ervin Norsa, if you still want to speak, put your hand back up, and we're happy to give you the opportunity. But maybe for now, let's move on to Zulfikar. Zulfikar, please go ahead. The floor is yours. And after your comments, we'll open up again for questions.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Graham and Natalie. I'll briefly talk about our experience about community policing and why, as a practitioner and as a police department, we felt the need to go for community policing. But before that, I'll just quickly refer to what Alberto talked about hotspot policing. In my experience, I think hotspot policing works mainly in areas where there is poor population density. So, for example, if you have a large metropolitan city with higher population density, I think hotspot policing would work very well there. We tried that in Lahore, it works quite well. But in areas where you have low population density, like in rural areas where we tried this community policing, I think there's a big difference there. We wouldn't have large effects with hotspot policing. Just a comment on that. Now, coming to our topic, the need for this project we felt was that in several high-profile cases in the province of Punjab, especially regarding small children, offenses against children and women, we felt that there was a very bad relationship between the community and the police. And as a result of that, as a department, we thought that we should go ahead and try community policing, especially in this Sheikhupura region, which had a lot of these issues. And one very kind of interesting input that we got into this was that once we had all of the data on complaints coming in, we had set up a computerized complaint management system. So we got kind of automated data of what kinds of complaints we were getting. And based on that, we found out that there was a need to reach out to the community because there was a dissonance between what the police was thinking is important, because police traditionally think of crimes like robbery or theft, those kinds of things, they think of those as important, but the community might have different priorities. So for example, during the town hall meetings, we found out that issues that police think are important are different from the issues that people might think are important for them. So I think that was a kind of an important consideration for us going into this. So going into this project, we had community policing forums where we had activated these forums, but an important kind of finding that we got along the way was that we didn't have a lot of women participation, because we found out that women wouldn't come forward in your traditional kind of forums. And because of that, we had to set up separate forums for women where we had lady police officers coming in as moderators, and they would actually kind of talk to the women, community members, and as a result, you would get a more detailed idea of what their issues were. So I think that's an important point there. Then the other thing that we tried to address was problem-oriented policing. How do you address the issues raised in these forums? We had a kind of a very detailed training methodology and infrastructure put in place, and so kind of trying to tweak out what are the most important issues from the community's point of view. So as I was saying, an important kind of finding for us was that while the police thinks of robberies and thefts and those kinds of things as important, the community might think of eve teasing as important. The community might think of, for example, gender-related crimes as important. And the community might think of, for example, drug use as important. So during these forums, we prepared community policing plans. And during these talks, we identified, so for example, the top 3 issues that the community would highlight. And based on that, we would set up our community policing plans. They were prepared. The real issue that I think we faced was that Graham has already referred to was frequent transfers of officers, and the other was kind of dedicating resources to the response. So you get to the issues. So for example, in a particular area, people will tell you that narcotics are a big problem. So the real issue is how do you get the resources to then address that issue in that particular area? And with all of the demands on police time and resources, and without adequate, organization resources to actually address these issues, I think that was the real problem that we had. the resource challenge, I think, is the biggest that we found in our case was relevant. One important consideration for us was, will people participate? We found that it was, people were very willing and they were actually very forthcoming. They wanted their voice to be heard. And I think we had a kind of a very large kind of effect that way, that people participated in these forums very actively, especially in the women forums. That was very encouraging. The real issue, one, resources, the other was, so on the demand side, there was a big response. But the real issue is when the supervisors get distracted because of other challenges. So part of this was done in an election year. So when you have elections, you have frequent transfers and postings because you want to ensure, the election commission wanted to ensure that there was neutrality, all of those considerations. So we had frequent transfers of officers. So your knowledge of the area and of people goes down, and the kind of resources that then you can allocate to addressing these problems that people have identified, that also goes down. So that, I think, is a big challenge. And the other big challenge going forward is, how do you get governments to allocate budgets for this? And how do you create structures based on this? Because the real, I think, outcome from this, from our point of view, was it does make a lot of difference from people's point of view in terms of their voice, in terms of their participation, in terms of them highlighting the issues. What are those issues? They might be related to municipal services, they might be related to other things. All of those are highlighted. But then how do you get the resources? How do you get the supervisory attention to address all of those issues? And how do you make sure that there is some effective response? Because when you do not see effective response, the interest in the forums and in the problem-oriented policing concept itself then goes down. And that, I think, is important. Trust does get enhanced in police, but on the action side, if you are weak, I think because of resource constraints or because of supervision issues, I think that is where more work needs to be done. And how do you actually get structures in place that are permanent, that are part of your regular police work? And how do you get resources in place which then address all of these problems on an ongoing basis, not as an ad hoc mechanism, which is on the side? I think that is what is important. And from our point of view, I think this was a very important experiment that it was very encouraging in the sense that it raised people's trust in the police. It raised, kind of people's participation in the system. But on the response side and on the action side, I think that's where a lot of work needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zulfikar. It's great to hear your reflections from the practitioner point of view. It's really fascinating. At this point, would anyone like to share any additional questions or comments? If you do, please go ahead and either type them up in the chat box or raise your virtual or your human hand. For now, I think I saw one question come in from Elena, which is a question I think for Graham, that said, as a follow-up to one of Natalie's points, did the study identify if other police forces were operating in the same areas? So Graham, if you could answer that, and then we'll see if there are any other questions or comments from the group here.
Thanks for that question. I don't have a complete answer for you, and it's something that we should spend more time thinking about. In several of the contexts, there are other police agencies that are operating. In Santa Catarina, there are civil police and military police, and we worked with the military police only. It was part of our design in our experiment in the Philippines, where there is both the Philippines National Police and kind of an auxiliary police force in many areas called TANODs. And we, in the research that team did, they compared different ways of connecting the police with those auxiliary TANODs or not connecting them. And so they'll be reporting in a couple of months about the effectiveness of having these more embedded local police that are appointed by local officials and remain in communities, as opposed to the Philippines National Police, who in rural areas in particular are sort of ephemerally present. But it's something that we'll spend a little bit more time thinking about in the context where it wasn't part of the design, like what how the police that we were working with interacted in terms of the crimes that they were investigating and how they interacted with those other forces. Thanks for that question.
Great, and I saw a hand go up, Erwin Norsa. If you can go ahead and speak, and please introduce yourself.
Hola a todos. Hi, I am Erwin Norsa. I am police officer in National Police of Colombia. I see that there is a translation. For that reason, I will speak in Spanish or Spanglish. Ok, lo que quiero preguntar inicialmente, o más bien sugerir dentro del análisis que se viene haciendo, es un reto para la policía de Colombia, creo que para las policías del mundo, es construir confianza, y se suma otro reto este año que se relaciona con todo lo que ha sucedido en el escenario de la pandemia y cómo la confianza se ha ido bastante afectada en todas las instituciones y entre ellas la policía. Entonces, hay preguntas que nos quedan aún por resolver en la policía de Colombia inicialmente, y creo que esta evidencia que ustedes muestran da grandes luces, y es relacionado a presencia de violencia híbrida, o en países como Colombia y Latinoamérica, donde tenemos contextos o territorios donde hay crimen organizado, hay delincuencia común, o hay otro tipo de delitos de convivencia ciudadana. En esos escenarios es mucho más complejo construir confianza, y me atrevería a decir que la confianza en la policía, en las ciudades o territorios donde hay economías criminales, al narcotráfico para el caso de Colombia, la motivación rentística elimina cualquier efecto que se pueda generar en confianza de la policía hacia la población. Y tendríamos que mirar lo que decía Santiago hace un momento, y es cómo los grupos armados pueden, digamos que, competir por esa confianza frente a la población. Entonces creo que el COVID nos deja retos de nuevo, la confianza se ve afectada en todas las instituciones y en la policía. Y segundo, cómo poder explicar desde Latinoamérica y en escenarios de países de violencia híbrida, como les acabo de indicar, la mejor forma de construir confianza o frente a la evidencia de lo que nos ha dicho. Creo que eso es en general para contar un poco lo de Colombia y sugerir preguntas que aún nos quedan por resolver y que ustedes ya dan luces al respecto. Gracias.
You're on mute, Sebastian.
Thanks. Muchas gracias, Erwin. And Graham, were you able to listen to the English translation? Okay, great. That's wonderful.
Great. Thanks for that question. I think that I don't have a complete answer for you, and I think that in conversation with Santiago Tobon and their research on, they were conducting research at exactly the same time as we were, and in fact we cooperated with them in setting up our experiments so that we could learn about a set of different interventions at the same time. I think that we'll need to kind of unpack how and whether there was substitution between security provisions by gangs and by the police. And I do think it's possible that some of the reason why it's difficult, why there are low levels of trust with the police, and two, why it's difficult to rebuild them through interventions that focus primarily on interactions with the police, that in the context that we were working in, that there are these other non-state actors that are both providing security and are trying to undermine citizen police trust. Certainly true in Colombia, in the Philippines to a certain extent. Our intervention was taking place in an area where there is a long-standing low-level insurgency that likely in some rural areas was competing for citizen hearts and minds with the state, as well as in Brazil to a certain extent. And so I do think that that's possible. I guess what I would say is that the community policing is being used in a set of post-conflict contexts with criminal violence, and I think there is a belief that this is a tool that can rebuild the connection between citizens and governments even in these difficult circumstances. And so I guess one way I'll take your question is that this might lead us to have some caution about whether this is something that's whether this is a set of changes that can work on its own in such challenging circumstances with non-state groups competing with the state, and as you mentioned, during COVID, when some of these in-person interactions currently can't take place.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. If anyone has a question, please go ahead, raise your hand, and we'll call on you. If there aren't any others, then maybe I'll take advantage to ask Graham a question, which is if there is a police department somewhere that's interested or had been planning on taking up community policing or starting a new community policing intervention, based on these results, what do you think you would recommend to them? You know, since the impact that, since you weren't able to see as much impact as perhaps that police department was hoping to see, is this something they should still be investing in, or should they direct their attention elsewhere? Yeah, or is there a specific way they should do it, or should they work with researchers to evaluate it in that context? What would you suggest?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an important question of like how do we translate these results from these 6 contexts into new contexts that maybe are a little bit different from these places, and where the interventions are undoubtedly going to differ a little bit as the interventions within our 6 contexts differed. And so I guess we think about it in a couple of different ways. One of them Natalie mentioned, which is that there's a divergence between the way that community policing practices are implemented in practice and the organizational philosophy that was promoted in the original conceptualization of community policing. And so a lot of the time when we present these results, there's a sense from the promoters of community policing and many practitioners that this isn't a true test of what community policing could be. And so I think we don't yet have the answer to whether transformational organizational change that is suggested in the founding documents of community policing, which involves fundamental changes to how police agencies are organized, not just changes in how beat officers are spending their time, and changes in how information is transmitted up and down the hierarchy, and also changes in government, in how other government agencies that are responsible for providing sanitation and providing lighting and all sorts of other city services that interact with underlying problems that lead to crime. Those relationships also need to change in addition to changes to citizens. And so I think what I would say is, like, we don't yet know whether that is the right set of tools, but in the way that it's currently being implemented, it seems to, I think this raises a set of questions and maybe creates a higher bar and a healthy skepticism that I would suggest to police agencies thinking about implementing this. What are the additional changes to your agency that you're going to make this effective? And what are the things that you're going to do that you think that these 6 police agencies didn't do that would have made it effective? And I think Zulfikar provided us one example of that, which is that I think in their view, this really comes down a lot to the resources that are provided to respond to community concerns. And what we saw is that the police weren't prioritizing that, faced a budget constraint, and didn't allocate resources to put up streetlights and hire additional officers in areas where they were required. And so I think that's a direction where we need future research to understand whether taking that next step that has been suggested out of this research is effective, or whether we need to really switch directions into other tools like hotspot policing or more transformational changes to how policing operates that are being suggested in the US and elsewhere, defunding the police and moving a lot of these responsibilities into other government agencies.
Great, thanks, Graham. So I've seen one hand go up, and I think we have time for 1 or 2. So I'll go with this one, and if anyone would like the last question, you should raise your hand soon before someone else does. Luis Garcia Hernandez, please go ahead.
Muy buenos días para todos. Gusto saludarlos. Habla el general Luis García. Yo soy el comandante actual de la Policía Metropolitana de Bucaramanga. De antemano agradecerles a cada uno de ustedes la oportunidad de escuchar estas experiencias que son vitales para mejorar el direccionamiento y el concepto de estrategia del servicio de la Policía Nacional. Quisiera hacer una reflexión muy corta acerca de las conclusiones y las consideraciones que se han venido dando en este espacio que lo valoramos mucho como comandantes. En primer lugar, el impacto que ha tenido toda la estrategia en la Policía Nacional de Colombia, el modelo de policía que actualmente tenemos. Creo que no hay que dejar de lado en cada uno de los países acerca de cuál es el modelo de policía que tenemos. Y el modelo de policía indudablemente tiene que ver mucho con los mandatos del gobierno nacional, que para el caso de Colombia, en las diferentes disposiciones y reglamentaciones que tiene Colombia, están en función de reducción del delito y control del delito. Este concepto, digamos, que viene de alto gobierno, que vuelvo y digo, está en los diferentes planes de gobierno, tiene un impacto muy grande en el funcionamiento y en la gestión operativa de cada cuerpo de policía, en este caso de la Policía Nacional. El impacto se viene dando en la medida de que, si bien es cierto, para intervenir los diferentes problemas públicos que están asociados, en este caso al delito, hay dos formas de hacerlo. Una, a través de la policía que en Colombia se ha denominado policía de cuadrantes, que tiene una función básicamente de control y prevención del delito. Y hay otro modelo que se ha venido quedando más en el plano de plan y estrategia, que lo desarrollan otro grupo de policías, más en función de prevención ciudadana, que es lo que actualmente en este espacio académico se ha denominado policía comunitaria. El peso actual, digamos, de acuerdo al mandato de gobierno, está muy enfocado a la reducción del delito, especialmente el homicidio urbano y rural en Colombia. Por ende, digamos, la medición que hace el cuerpo de policía acerca de la eficacia policial está dado más en función de lo que hace actualmente la policía de cuadrantes, que es la policía orientada a tener menos delitos en cada uno de los barrios. Indudablemente, al no incorporarse el modelo comunitario en el modelo de gestión policial y en el modelo de policía, queda solamente en el plano de una estrategia o de un plan. Y esa estrategia la valoramos mucho, tiene más una función de asistencia social a las entidades territoriales, en este caso a las alcaldías. Las alcaldías que tienen por función, digamos, y por responsabilidad la seguridad ciudadana, tienen una serie de programas y la dificultad en este momento de la asistencia social que se hace por parte de la policía comunitaria en los barrios y las diferentes comunidades no se articula fácilmente con los programas de las secretarías que tienen, en este caso, educación, interior, cultura. Cada alcaldía tiene una serie de dependencias que tienen unos proyectos y unos programas, pero la dificultad y el reto, yo creo, estaría en conectar cada uno de los programas que tienen las alcaldías en sus planes de gobierno a nivel territorial para que policía comunitaria pudiera facilitar y prestar esa asistencia social que es importante y complementaria. En ese sentido, estoy de acuerdo con los resultados de la investigación, por cuanto en este momento la ciudadanía valora mucho el policía comunitario porque es una fuente del Estado para escuchar las problemáticas, especialmente el microtráfico y el expendio de sustancias en vía pública, en calle pública, es una de las situaciones que más afecta al ciudadano, pero indudablemente la ausencia de conexión de otros programas de prevención social, pues tiene un impacto, digamos, muy grande, inclusive en la reputación de del mismo cuerpo y la misma institución policial. Digamos que es mi reflexión, estaría más, digamos, en función de que la policía comunitaria no se quede en el plano solamente una estrategia o un plan, que se pueda incorporar inclusive al funcionamiento de los procesos misionales del cuerpo de policía, un poco más allá al mismo mandato de gobierno que viene en las diferentes leyes o disposiciones o regulaciones que saca el gobierno nacional para cada vigencia. Desde esa manera se tendría, digamos, un impacto no como estrategia o plan, sino que se incorporaría en el funcionamiento del cuerpo de policía. Segundo, que las entidades territoriales, en este caso las alcaldías, a la hora de elaborar sus planes integrales de seguridad y convivencia ciudadana y sus planes de desarrollo municipal, logren conectar los diferentes programas que tienen los despachos de la Secretaría, las entidades territoriales, con los programas de asistencia social que tiene la Policía Comunitaria. En el caso nuestro se ha denominado PRESI, que es la Policía de Prevención Ciudadana. De esta manera, creería yo que se incrementan los espacios y la confianza ciudadana. De lo contrario, la reputación y la confianza ciudadana en el cuerpo de policía iría en decremento, por cuanto son problemas públicos que la policía no soluciona sin el concurso de las autoridades políticas.
Muchas gracias. No, muchas gracias, Comandante Garcia. Thank you very much. I wonder if perhaps Natalie would like to respond to that, and I think you could do so in Spanish or English.
Okay, no, thank you, Sebastian. I think it was more than a question, a great comment. Y efectivamente, comandante, excelente contribución, coincido totalmente con su perspectiva, y de hecho fue de los análisis que hacemos desde el Banco Interamericano de cómo este tema debe estar transversal a toda la misión de lo que debe ser la policía, y no debe ser un elemento ad hoc o un curso, efectivamente, que quiera reemplazar lo que debe ser una filosofía mucho más interiorizada en la institución. Creo que hoy más que nunca, incluir estos elementos que llevan a crear confianza y legitimidad se hace más importante y relevante. Estamos viendo alrededor de la región una gran manifestaciones de la ciudadanía que tiene una protesta en otras formas, en donde siempre el encontrarse, digamos, la presencia del Estado reflejado en la policía, hay justamente esa línea gris entre mantener el orden público y probablemente en algunos momentos llegar hasta las violaciones de derechos humanos. Y ahí se derriba todo el tema de la confianza que puede existir hacia las instituciones. Por otra parte, vemos también que la situación en América Latina, con todo esto de la crisis del COVID, puede poner, digamos, gran presión en los organismos de seguridad, porque vemos también varios de los factores que pueden ser generadores a futuro de lo que es mayor violencia. Y es algo que estamos estudiando, de hecho, de la mano de la Policía de Colombia, con la Universidad de AFID, haciendo análisis con respecto a esta situación que debe poner mayor alerta a cómo no se pierde la legitimidad y la confianza que es tan necesario para las sociedades en democracia. Y yo creo que este es un punto que nos lleva a una reflexión muy importante, y sobre todo en América Latina, como lo mencioné, donde tenemos, no en el caso de Colombia, pero sí en muchos lugares, instituciones de policía muy frágiles.
Great, thank you, Natalie. So we're almost out of time, but before finishing, there was one hand that went up, so I'm going to give the last question or comment to Joran Buzabo. Please go ahead and please introduce yourself if you can at the beginning. Joran, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Okay, so I'll give it a second to see if we can fix the microphone issue that might be happening, and if not, then I think maybe we can follow up by email afterwards.
Hello, can
there
you
you
hear
are.
me?
We can hear you now. Yes.
All right. I would like to appreciate Mr. Breyer. I was not able to hear the Spanish very well, but also I would say mucho gracias. It's been good, and I would like to appreciate the community policing approach. There was a kind of doubt of whether it has so far produced the results when he was asked if this would be the continuous approach. And I would say very good. It should be according to where I come from and the results we are still receiving here. I would say this is the best approach. And what we need probably today is going down into breaking it to our communities probably, and that fits the way we move, the tyranny and the geographical setting. We have across our country realized that this would produce even more excellent results if we could have what it takes to invest in it more. And when you try to do some reading about the rest of the world, you find this is the kind of approach that will move deep into our communities for safe business communities, for safe educational environment, for safe local communities in our cities. So we need to add more ingredients probably on how best we can now reach down to our local communities in their settings. I'd like to appreciate the organizers and really appreciate the comment of Mr. Greer and saying we need to hold on and probably add more. Thank you very much.
Sebastian, you're on mute.
Thank you, Joran, and thank you, Graham. So at this point, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our roundtable. Unless anyone, has some pressing sort of last-minute thoughts they'd like to share, perhaps Graham, Natalie, or Zulfikar. If not, I think we should end, as I imagine people have things to run to.
Thank you so much, everyone. I learned a lot, and I think a lot of ideas came up here that motivate future research that we'd love to do together to try to identify what context this might work in and what might need to be added to community policing to make it effective. So feel free to get in touch.
Well, just thank you to all the organizers. It was really great, and I wanted to stress on my invitation on organizing more of this kind of meeting in share experiences and knowledge, and I think it was very valuable for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie and Graham. Well, great. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your active participation. I'm really glad that we did this as a roundtable and that we had so much participation as we did today. I think this worked really, really well. So thank you on behalf of EGAP and IPA. It's been such a pleasure sharing this time with you. And thank you to Zulfikar, Natalie, and Graham for being with us today and for preparing those remarks. If you have any further questions or comments about this research, please do get in touch with us and we can continue the conversation offline. And I want to take Natalie up on the offer of doing more of these. So if it's okay with the participants, we'll reach out to you and let you know when we have more events like this in the future. So looking forward to seeing you all soon. And thanks again for being with us today. Bye.